right, good afternoon, it's me again. So, I'm here to talk about melons, and we used to have this talk given by an extension specialist who is no longer with us. She retired, but Marita Cantwell, who's officially our specialist for vegetables, and she did a lot of work on melons. So a lot of the stuff that I'm going to present today is her work. That said, I have been working with melons for about 14 years now, so I also know a thing or two about that crop. So here we go. All you want to know about melon ripening and quality, but we're afraid to ask. And the very take-home message, if you don't get anything else from this 25-minute talk, is just in this slide. And that's the fact that really, and we talked about this a little bit earlier this morning, is that you really should not ripen melon. Okay, so that's sort of the take-home, meaning that the maturity at harvest for a melon, you should be harvesting melons when they have already begun ripening. Okay, I will talk about, maybe you can treat with ethylene, maybe you can do this or that. But really, the basic thing that you can do for a melon to be good, eating quality, reaching the consumer, is to harvest it as late as possible when it's already started to ripen. So really, then with that in mind, what we're doing post-harvest is trying to slow down that ripening so that you have a chance to distribute it, to transport it, and so that it reaches the consumer in an acceptable condition, and it's not because it is going to soften. So your major tool here is going to be temperature. Okay, and we'll talk about various other things, but temperature is really key. All right. So when we say melons, right, there's a whole range of crops that we're talking about. There is the orange flesh cantaloupe and, orange flesh honeydew or honey loops, these sorts of things. And then you have the honeydews and the specialty melons like canaries and Crenshaw and Piel de Sapo. And, so also depending on the country, you'll have different types of melons. And then you have the watermelon in there. So all of these, the orange flesh and some of the specialty melons will be climacteric. And then the honeydews and the watermelons are typically on the non-climacteric side, right? However, if you've worked with watermelon, you know that they are extremely sensitive to ethylene. And you have to be mindful of this when you're storing them. You don't want to store watermelons with fruits that produce ethylene because you're going to have damage and the flesh will basically become super watery, right? But here's a table that basically gives you a lot of information about respiration rates and internal ethylene. So you can see, right, that the ones that are clearly climacteric, they produce the cantaloupes, they produce quite a fair amount of ethylene versus something like a watermelon, a canary, or a honeydew that are really, the honeydew is kind of on the verge. Remember I said you have groups and then things fall very clearly into categories and things are kind of like a little bit in the middle, right? So honeydew would be one of these that is a little bit in the middle. Where it really essentially behaves like a non-climacteric fruit, but if you treat it with ethylene, it will respond, it will eventually, do the same things that a climacteric fruit does. And then you have various, soluble solid content, which we'll talk about again. So quality attributes for melon, we're looking at flavor, color, texture, which, essentially, in this case, flavor, we mean sugars and acids and volatiles, so the chemical components of flavor, and then the texture. and the color. So those are the things that consumers really care about when they eat a melon. And all of these quality attributes can be affected by all of these different variables, like what kind of varieties, so the genetics, the pre-harvest conditions, the season, maturity at harvest, super important, number of harvest, storage conditions, etc. Really, our main focus is always on maturity at harvest, and this continues to be a huge challenge, and I'll address that later. Okay. So as far as color is concerned, melons produce pigments that are called carotenoid pigments. So when it's a green flesh, you're going to have few carotenoids, mostly chlorophyll. Makes sense, right? Chlorophyll is green. And then for the orange flesh, it's going to be beta-carotene and other, orange carotenoids. And then for watermelon, it's not on there, but it's lycopene, just like a tomato. And so we assess the color based on color measurements and chroma value, and basically the higher the chroma value, the brighter the color in orange is going to be. So for texture, we use texture analyzers and penetrometers to assess the texture of melon flesh. And you have a really nice relationship from the instrumental firmness to the sensory perception of softness or firmness, right? So that's a really nice tool to have. Of course, it's destructive. So there are some algorithms that will relate non-disruptive compression firmness to internal firmness, but that really, the value of these algorithms really depend on the thickness of the rind, right? And you can imagine that if you have a cantaloupe or a melon that has a really thick rind and a lot of netting, it's going to be much more challenging to relate that non-destructive measurement of firmness to a destructive flesh measurement, right? So, again, that talks back to the importance of choosing your varieties. All right, so flavor, chemical flavor. So we have sugars, acids, and aroma volatiles. So in cantaloupe, remember we said that Brix reading, or your soluble solid content, we like to call it soluble solids and not Brix, because then you really have, that idea that it's everything in the juice, right? All the solids in the juice versus only sugars. But in cantaloupe, really, there's not a lot of other components in the juice that can affect the reading, and so it's mostly sugar. You have over 50% sucrose, 20% glucose, 26% fructose, and so your soluble solid content reading is generally pretty well correlated to the concentration of sugar inside of the fruit. Acids are typically not important for melon, right? I mean, when is the last time that you ate a melon and you thought, ooh, it's kind of acidic? They don't really have any acids to speak of that they accumulate. And then, of course, the aroma volatiles. Hopefully you remember from this morning, I showed you that those are really important for flavor and even the perception of sweetness. Okay. So again, back to sugar content. In the United States, we have maturity, minimum legal maturity indices that are based on a minimum soluble solids content in the flesh. So the very bare minimum is a 9 for cantaloupe. And if you want to be fancy, you have to go up to 11, which, from my work and the work of Marita, It's pretty low, but that's the minimum legal requirement. And there is a good relationship between sugar content and the percent soluble solids that a refractometer gives you. That relationship sort of breaks down a little bit after harvest. And why do you think that would be? What happens after you've harvested the cantaloupe? We said that there's no starch in a cantaloupe, right? So the sugar content will kind of decrease after harvest because those sugars are used for respiration as respiratory substrates, right? So the sugar content will always decrease. However, your soluble solid content may remain the same, and that's because it's softening, and all of these little fragments of the cell wall that are being released actually then contribute to your soluble solids content reading, and so that may appear as though you're not really doing anything to the sugar content. Okay, so this is from my work over the years, looking at different varieties of cantaloupe. This was a study on Syngenta varieties. And basically what we found is that if we ask people to taste different varieties of melon, and we ask them, okay, how much do you like it overall, you can see that there's absolutely no correlation between the soluble solids content of that melon and the overall liking. So you can have, things that are almost at the same level of liking, but see the amount of difference that there is between a soluble solid content of, less than 8 and an over 12, right? So about, like really huge difference in soluble solid content. But that melon, which has less bricks, is liked even higher than these. How can that be, right? So I really want you to, I want this to sink in. The melons are really kind of a different animal when it comes to, what we've been thinking about in terms of, okay, sugar content, soluble solids, right? That it's not really a clear-cut correlation, and that's because of volatiles and aroma, okay? So we'll kind of come back to that. All right, so I've said that already, right? So after harvest, your sugar content is always going to decrease, no matter what. So this is actual measurement of sugar content, sugars, at harvest, and after 2, 4, 6, and 8 weeks after harvest. So the sugars always decrease. And of course, the more mature, the riper the melon you started with, the higher the sugar content at harvest, and the higher the sugar content you're always going to have, right, compared to a melon that has been harvested less mature, okay? So they both decrease in the same way, but you always get more sugar in the end if you have a higher maturity melon. It's not weeks, it's days. Sorry about that. I said weeks. Okay, so again, back to aroma. We know that as melons mature, you will have an increase in the production of aroma compounds by the fruit. And so again, as the fruits start to ripen, you have the production of these things that is very important even for the perception of sweetness. So look at the difference it makes between a stage 2, which is about a quarter slip, to a stage 5, which is full slip, right? Huge difference in the amount of aroma compounds that the melon produces, even though the soluble solid content might be quite similar. And this is why this one will be perceived as being way sweeter compared to this one. So this brings me to the topic that I've been sort of crusading on, is the long shelf life trait. And I'm I wonder how many people are familiar with that term, the LSL melon or LSL cantaloupe. Yeah, it's basically almost all of the melons you find. Maybe not in California at peak season because we're still fortunate to have farmers that are willing to grow these old-style Western shipper varieties. But really, by and large, especially the ones that come from Central and South America, are long shelf life LSL melons. You can call them Harper. You can call them, but that's basically. So what this means is that the industry said, "Oh man, wouldn't it be nice if we had melons that didn't soften, that we could process for fresh cut, and we could hold them really, again, we're in the warehouse business, right? So we want them to have as long of a shelf life, storage life as possible." And the seed companies listened, and they came up with these new cultivars of long shelf life melons that never softened. So how did they do that? Well, we actually don't really know the genetic basis for the LSL trait. It's probably a multigenic trait. But what we do know is that these new varieties of melons produce very little ethylene. They are almost non-climacteric, and they respond very slowly, if at all, to ethylene. Okay? So basically, we've turned a climacteric fruit that relied on ethylene for softening and aroma production, and we turn them into big, hard balls that cannot soften, cannot respond to ethylene, and cannot produce aroma. They can get sweet, but what have I been telling you about sweetness and perception of sweetness, sugar content, and aroma? If you don't have aroma, people think that they are not sweet, in fact, right? So the melons that you find in your fruit salads, the cubes there, they are LSL melons, and probably the reason why you think that you don't like melon, because those things are a travesty, right? So they are doing this with the cantaloupes that we have here in the United States. They are also doing this with Charente melons, which are melons that are highly prized for their aroma in France and other parts of Europe. And now you have LSL Charentes that don't smell like anything, and it's really a travesty. Okay, so how do you assess maturity? Historically, you have used the crack around the stem, and that's called the slip, right? And this is controlled by ethylene, okay? So because the melon, when it starts ripening, it starts producing ethylene, it will start to form this crack around the stem. And when the cracks just starts forming, right, it's just around half of the stem, that's called a half slip. And if it's full circle around, that's called a full slip. You can also look at the desiccation of the first leaf after on the stem, and the netting around the stem. All of these are indicators, but by and large, the best indicator we had was the slip. And unfortunately, in the new long shelf life varieties, that is gone, right? Because they don't produce enough ethylene to be able to produce that slip. So what do they do now? Well, if they don't have that indicator, you used to be able to just pull the fruit off the vine when it was ready to be harvested. Now you can't do that, so what do? Clip, clip, right? And you can see it in the store. The melons are clipped. They're no longer just pulled out, especially maybe in peak season. Okay. All right, so to tell you in numbers what I'm saying here, you have the half slip. This is the amount of ethylene that's produced. A full slip, you see a doubling almost of the ethylene production, and it will continue to rise as the fruit continues to ripen and soften after harvest. Look at the soluble solids, though. It used to be that the very old varieties, they increased their soluble solids content between half-slip and full slip, but no longer the case with more recent cultivars. Okay, so how do you tell maturity in a melon? External color is important. For something like a honeydew that doesn't have the slip, you can look at it from the smoothness of the peel, the outside, right? If there are little hair, it's not ripe. If it's very smooth, it's ripe. So all of these are good indicators of quality. Okay. So these are different classes, and it's not really here in terms of slip or, but if you have a mature and unripe melon, it won't develop to the same kind of quality that a class 2 that was already starting to ripen when it was harvested. So this is a very busy slide. Please focus on the red line, which is the soluble solids. So you can see that this is kind of what Marita would argue the very bare minimum. The bare minimum by legal standards is a 9, but really you want to be at a 10, which means that you're kind of like trotting that line of the class 0 versus the class 1, but this is really where you want to be harvesting and even up to those points, and not really even in terms of the honeydew. Okay, so more numbers here. You know, again, you have these different classes, and you can see that for the honeydew, as you increase in ripeness at harvest, you will definitely see an improvement in soluble solid content. For honeydew, that's important because honeydews don't make as much aroma volatiles as cantaloupe. So really, the soluble solid content is a good indicator for quality. Okay, so storage conditions. Honeydew and watermelon are typically more sensitive to chilling injury than cantaloupes are. Cantaloupes, you can keep them pretty safely at 2.5 degrees, but you wanna have high relative humidity in all kinds. I already talked to you about the fact that watermelon are sensitive to ethylene, and you really shouldn't be storing them next to something that produces ethylene. Okay. This is just to show that soluble solids are either flat after harvest, or sometimes decrease a little bit depending on the temperature that you store them at. Firmness definitely decreases after harvest, but you can see between class 1 and class 2 for a honeydew, you don't really get, you know, an improvement if you harvest a little less mature, right? So there's no difference between softening between class 1 and class 2. So since this is going to be the one giving you the better eating quality, you really want to shoot for harvesting at a class 2. Okay. Some people do modified atmosphere or controlled atmosphere, and you can get some benefit out of that. You really have to make sure that you open the bag to degas and let the fruit sit at room temperature before you market it, because otherwise you'll get off flavor development. You can use MCP. This is also, again, a busy slide. The take home is that MCP helps you if you want to store the melons at a higher temperature. If you do a good job at temperature management, you don't need MCP, and you don't get a benefit if you do cold plus MCP. Okay, the only benefit you get is for Gallia, where you have a reduction of loss of firmness if you store even in the cold. Okay, and of course it's beneficial for watermelon. It really avoids, you know, if you know that you're going to be exposed to ethylene, you can really manage that by treating with 1-MCP. Okay, so that's kind of saying what I just said. It helps with softening, but it doesn't help with soluble solids. You know, we've done some studies on, well, okay, so since aroma is so important, can we treat with ethylene and bring the aroma back that way? We can do that. It does improve aroma a little bit. It does not have any effect on sweetness, and you get less firm of a fruit. So, you know, just be careful and know that it will decrease your firmness if you treat with ethylene. And so this is the same thing, and this is to say that LSL, the long shelf life, they are not responsive to ethylene. All right, so, you know, again, what I've said, we've turned a perfectly good climacteric fruit into a non-climacteric fruit. All right, so they don't respond to ethylene. All right, and so this is the conclusion slide. I'm sorry I went a little bit over time, but same take-home message: maturity, maturity, maturity. And I'm actually submitting a project to the Specialty Crops Research Initiative to try to help with that. So if anyone is interested, come talk to me and we can get you on the project. All right, thank you.